And now here we are, Michelangelo's David. This is his city. This is Florence. You'll see the famous Duomo in the background. And this is where Michelangelo grew up, of course. He suffered from some early childhood trauma, which certainly affected his work and also his chosen profession. In fact, his mother died when he was 6 years old, and he went to live with a nanny whose husband was a stonecutter, and then eventually showed a great deal of talent in that area and ended up apprenticing with the House of Medici. Here's the original location of the David. It was outdoors, of course, here in the Palazzo della Signoria, outside of the Palazzo Vecchio, which just translates from the Italian into the Old Palace. It's basically the Florentine City Hall. The statue itself was commissioned by the Wool Guild, and it was a completion of a project that had begun 40 years earlier by another sculptor, Agostino di Duccio, out of a colossal piece of Carrara marble, which ended up being Michelangelo's favorite sort of marble to carve with. The piece was flawed, but Michelangelo was arrogant enough and also, well, successful, so his arrogance may have been justified in still being able to make this piece. The story of its transportation, they built railroad through the city in order to move it, and it's quite extraordinary. It was damaged, however, in a city riot when city officials were throwing furniture and desks and chairs outside of the windows from above. So after it was damaged, it was brought to the Accademia. Here he is, the David. Just to give you a sense of scale, you can see how truly massive this statue is. It's 17 feet, and in fact, I think you could argue it's a study in irony in some ways. The point of the story of David in the original in Samuel is that he is a small boy, and he is attempting to defeat a giant in battle. And Michelangelo, in a really fantastic and innovative and interesting turn, has turned that boy into a giant himself. Now, onto some of the more interesting pieces here. If we look at a close-up here, you can begin to get a sense of the way in which Michelangelo has chosen to depict the scene. It's a very interesting medium, sculpture, when it comes to telling a story. If we have a narrative, that is to say, we tell a story in words, we're able to tell the story from beginning to end. Sculpture, however, is something like a freeze frame, and the sculptor has to pick a moment that they believe is most effective to tell the story. In the case of Michelangelo, of course, in stark contrast to other sculptors, he has chosen to decide to depict the moment before the climactic moment. In many ways, the moment of the story that's filled with the most dramatic tension. You can see in David's face this incredible anxiety and worry and concern, perhaps a bit of confidence, I suppose, too. But at this moment, there's no telling what the casting of the stone from this sling is actually going to convey, what his actual fate will be. So it's extraordinary that that Michelangelo has chosen to depict that particular moment. There's also the incredible interest in that this is the first statue since the statue of Nike at Samothrace. If you guys have ever seen the movie Titanic, it's actually, believe it or not, based off of that particular statue, which is it's a statue of winged victory at the front of the prow of a ship. And what happens in that sculpture, as here, is the sculpture is in fact it's interacting with the outside environment. So Goliath is not depicted, but yet he's there in the mind of David, and it's an extraordinary moment in the history of sculpture when David decides to do that. We won't dwell on the perfection of the piece, although it is really extraordinary. it's almost as if one of the best explanations I've ever heard of the David is from Mrs. Nelson, in fact, and she described it as you can imagine a body emerging out of milk, laying flat, and that's sort of how the David presents itself, and in fact how Michelangelo himself would have carved it. There are various interesting visual corrections that Michelangelo makes. I'll just note one here since I have it on the slide, and that is David's hand. First, of course, note the incredible detail down to the veins coming out in his arm and his hand. But Michelangelo, in fact, depicts this hand somewhat larger than it would be in reality, in order that by means of perspective, it appears to be appropriately proportioned. And just the last slide here. This gives you a better sense of the piece as a whole, and you can see David holding his weapon of choice there in his left hand, and then the back of it is hanging down, and he has the rest of the sling in his right hand, which we just looked at a detail of. If you want to see a perfection of the contrapposto pose, it is certainly herein. You can see the weight of the statue is completely on the right leg due to some imperfections in the marble and the sheer size of it. Michelangelo does include a tree stump behind David to give it a little bit of stability. And then you can see the fully relaxed left leg, which is not supporting any weight whatsoever. Again, like the Critias boy that we looked at earlier, you can see the S shape of the torso. You would also see that reflected in the back. There's this really beautiful interplay of tension and relaxation, which mimics in many ways the narrative moment in the actual piece. So he has that tense left arm and relaxed left leg, and then he has the tense right leg and the relaxed left arm. Truly a masterpiece. And just briefly, I'll add one more note here on the other purpose besides the artistic purpose or the aesthetic purpose and the narrative purpose of the statue of David. There's also a political or propaganda purpose as well, which is very interesting and part of the power of the piece. What Michelangelo is doing in his original position here, here's the Palazzo Vecchio, is he is staring down Rome itself. So Florence associated itself or found itself having a lot in common with David, in that it was a relatively small city-state, and yet in war and financially and artistically, it was something of a giant, but battling titanic powers like Rome in this era of warring city-states, and so David was a natural choice in that respect.